Hi, everyone. So we're just going to give people a few minutes to trickle in. I think we've got about 30 people already, so that's really great to see. And take a minute if you want to adjust your name. Feel free to keep your video off or on, whatever works for you. And yeah, we decided to go with the meeting format instead of the webinar format. A lot of people might be used to. It's kind of nice to see people who you're in the discussion with. Then it makes me feel like I'm not talking to an empty living room, which is really nice. And so we're going to get kicked off, I don't know, maybe 7:03, 7:04. The last night I was thinking of how to kill a few minutes as we got started, and I thought I would love to know, and if you want to type it into the chat, feel free, of when you think of home, what plant means home to you? And I thought it might be a nice way to start. And so in other words, thinking of home, is there a plant that comes to mind? And for me, I was thinking of my childhood home and growing up on the prairies and, you know, being surrounded by canola and wheat, but we had this tiny little sliver of native prairie that survived because it was a moraine. And so I always think of Saskatoons and brown-eyed Susans and buffalo beans. So feel free to pop that in the chat if you want. Krystal, Caitlynn, I might put you on the spot. Krystal, I know you're a big plant nerd, plant lover.
Oh, I'm totally fine with nerd. That's my preferred title. Oh, plant that makes me think of home. I have a favorite plant, but I think usually it's the smell of like a pine forest, I grew up in Porter Creek, so just back behind towards McIntyre Creek, is sort of in the Greenbelt. And you know, like in the spring when the snow melts and it just gets that like you walk through that pine forest smell, I think that would be less so maybe a specific plant, but yeah, that's what would remind me of home.
I love that. I'm seeing things trickle in on the chat. I'm getting rhubarb. Definitely lots of memories of that one. Oh, jacaranda. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And wattle, spruce, arbutus, red trilliums. Caitlynn, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I have two. Am I allowed to have two?
I had three, so I just went with it.
Okay. I'd say bergamot because it's my grandma's favorite flower, and it grew in the meadow on my grandparents' farm. And then prairie sage because I'm from Saskatchewan, and that is the most. I don't know, when I go home and I'm walking around in the dry prairies, it's like welcomes you home. Or wolf willow. I also love the smell of wolf willow, and I don't get that very much here. So, yeah,
I'm glad you named those off. Those were on my short list. Yeah. We'll get started soon, but I see in the chat we've got alder, bare root, soapberries, sugar maple, peace rosebush, fireweed, lily of the valley. So thank you. Everyone has made the gray day a little bit cheerier. So thank you. I guess we can get started for why we're actually here. And I don't have a lot of housekeeping, but I guess I'll just ask everyone to stay on mute until just so we don't have any background noise. And then we'll keep the questions till the end so we can see the full presentation. But if you don't want to forget it, you can always pop it in the chat and we can make sure we get to it at the end. My name is Randy. I'm the conservation manager with CPAWS Yukon. If you're not familiar with our organization, we're a conservation organization, and we advocate for wildlife, wild spaces, and the ways of life that are connected to both, and striving to do all of that in a framework of reconciliation and holding the value that healthy communities and people matter a lot for conservation. And mining is an activity that's really intertwined with all of those values as well. And so I'm really excited that we could host this talk tonight. And tonight I'm joining you from the traditional territory of Kwanlindun First Nation and Ta'an Quachin Council. But really what we're talking about, you know, reclamation, new mining legislation is something that touches the traditional territories of all First Nations in the Yukon, as well as transboundary Indigenous groups. So I can't wait to hear the presentation tonight, and it's really timely because the Yukon is in the middle of working on new mining legislation. So there's this real tangible opportunity for change. So before Krystal and Caitlynn present, I'm going to speak just a little bit about that opportunity. I'm going to try and be brief, but I just want to say I'm going to give them a formal introduction later on, but they're just two like phenomenally smart and insightful women. They approach their research with such integrity and just know the value of building really meaningful relationships. And the theme of their talk, "The past is also the present," is one that really resonated with me. You know, it's often said that mining has changed, that these aren't your grandfather's mines. And I think that's true, and also that it isn't. You know, of course, there's been improvements. We have new technologies. There's been changes to mining policy, mining laws. But at the same time, the core of our legislation has stayed the same. We still have a free entry system that prioritizes mining above other rights and values. We have technology getting more complex, mines getting bigger. We're moving more rock to get at lower grade ore. We have mines connected into global markets and capitalist systems. So at this, you know, as some things have gotten better, some things have stayed the same. And there's also just these new and different ways to make mistakes. Of course, I can't change my, oh, okay, there we go. So these are some headlines pulled from the past years that just show how the past continues to be the present. You know, we continue to have mines not pay their full financial security. This has happened many times in the past. There have to be continued calls for the free entry system to change. I know Caitlynn is going to be speaking about the Faro mine, but some of those same systemic mistakes have rippled forward into other mines like Wolverine and Mount Nansen, and who knows what mines moving forward. So fortunately, the Yukon has embarked on developing new mining legislation, and I give a lot of kudos to our Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources for saying that, you know, it's not just tweaks around the edges. We're going for big changes here, and that sentiment was also shared by the Grand Chief. Maybe a couple of you are wondering, like, wait, didn't we talk about this a few years ago? That was actually the Yukon Mineral Development Strategy, which was this big engagement touching on everything from mining promotion to taxes to all these different pieces of legislation. But the moment we're at now is really focused on two acts, the Placer Mining Act and the Quartz Mining Act. And so this legislation is being developed collaboratively by Yukon government and by First Nations. They formed a steering committee. They've been chatting for the last year or so about what changes are needed and what options are there for making these changes. Yukon Conservation Society, myself have taken part in some of those discussions, providing input. Same with the mining industry, just providing some input. So coming out of that government to government and stakeholder input process, we're now at public engagement. And that is open until May 9th, next Tuesday. And I think there's a lot to applaud about the approach that Yukon government and First Nations have taken, where there's a bunch of options that people can look at, talk about the pros and cons, what they think of it, versus, you know, the government just coming in and saying, this is what we want to do. What do you think of it? But it's created, I don't know, a doozy of a survey to wade through. If you're really keen, there's a 57-page discussion document you can read and then do the survey that's based on that. I know for many people, especially if it's not your job, that is maybe a superhuman effort. That is my job, and I haven't even finished it yet. I know Lewis from Yukon Conservation Society finished it a few weeks ago, but we can't all be him, even if we want to aspire to. So I know there's lots of knowledgeable folks in this call, and maybe, you know, you don't have any issues waiting into the survey, but I just quickly wanted to run into some options if you're not as comfortable just diving in. So one thing you can do, you can go to the CPAWS Yukon website. Adil is going to pop, Adil, our communications manager, is going to pop that link into the chat. And we've provided a little bit of general info, a link to the survey and discussion document if you want to dive in, and then our thoughts on some of the topics. And we've tackled some of the topics in the survey, not all of them. That just wasn't manageable for anyone. But a point I want to quickly make is, you know, you look at this list of topics, and I think it can be intimidating if you don't have a background in, you know, technical mining or policy. But at their core, these topics are all tied to values. And I think that's something that we all are deserving to weigh in on. You think about something like mineral tenure, the free entry system, and changing it. That's really about honoring other rights and values. Financial security can be about taking responsibility. Royalties, fair sharing, reclamation, maybe you think of it as treating the land with respect. It could also be knowing your limits. It can be keeping your promises. This isn't a complete list of values, just to show how these really technical topics are really undercut by values. So for each of these topics, we provide a little bit of background information and brief thoughts on some of the current issues. And then below, if you would like to do some of the survey questions and you need a bit of an entry point, we've provided some text that you could use as a starting point to answer the survey. The idea is that it's always easier to start from something, not a blank page. I know, because I started with a blank page when I wrote these and it was really hard. So you can feel free to use this text. Maybe it gives you a bit of a background. Build on it, delete it, edit it, whatever works for you. If you need more information, give us a call, give me an email. Or you could also just send in your thoughts by email and not worry about the survey. You can just talk about what you want to see, what you don't want to see with mining in the future. And Adil is going to put the email, the Yukon government email, into the chat as well. So you can take that option. A couple other resources. I know Malcolm Boothroyd, who works with us, put together a really great story map that I really is beautiful. So feel free to take a look at that. And I know Yukon Conservation Society, I believe, has put up Lewis's responses to the survey. So maybe someone from YCS can pop that link in the chat when you've got a chance. And if other folks know of resources that have been helpful for you, just please add those in as well. But so the main point I want to get across is you don't need to be an expert in mining policy. These topics can be really jargony, but personally, I feel that being able to wade into decisions that affect you, even when you don't know the technical terms, is a matter of equity and justice. So I'd urge you to remember that you're an expert when it comes to your own hopes, dreams, vision, and you should feel free to express that. And I know there's lots of smart people at Yukon government and at the First Nation governments who can take what you said and translate it into the options that they presented with this survey. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers and get to the talk. So Caitlynn Beckett is a settler scholar from Treaty 4 territory and grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan. She's now a PhD candidate in geography at Memorial University, where she also completed her master's in 2017. She's lived and worked in Whitehorse since 2019. As part of her research, Caitlynn has a research agreement with Ross River Dena Council and has worked with Denicho Environmental and Remediation, a company owned by Ross River. Her research focuses on the remediation of contaminated mining landscapes, environmental justice, impact assessment, and community engagement in resource extraction across northern Canada. And Krystal Isbister was born and raised in Whitehorse and has been working in northern ecosystems since 2007. Her primary interests are in northern disturbance ecology, especially how people and plants interact in places disturbed by industry. After completing her master's in plant science in 2017, that's how she got her degree in Plant Nerd, she established Flora Tech Consulting. She works with First Nation, corporate, and public sector clients, providing technical and training services in applied plant ecology and ecological restoration. She began her PhD in land reclamation at the University of Alberta in 2020 to study challenges she was experiencing in her work. Her work focuses on the meanings of reclamation success in the Yukon and how local expectations can be better incorporated into reclamation policy and practice. And so I'm going to let you pop up your screen, Krystal, and I'm very excited to learn.
Okay, can you see that clearly? Awesome. Well, thanks for the introductions, Randy. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Caitlin and I are going to talk about how the past is also the present a bit about mining reclamation, some lessons from Faro, and the promise of the new mining legislation. And now there we go. Okay. So you've got a little introduction to who we are. Again, I'm Krystal Isbister. I'm grateful to live and work now in Cascadena territory in the southeast Yukon and Mount Watson Lake. I love plants. That's how I got into reclamation. And yeah, I'm working on a PhD.
Hey, I won't add too much to Randy's great introduction. I'll just explain this picture. I'm at Faro with my boss and friend Stu and an elder Kathleen Souza from Ross River. And that's where my research and work obligations are to the community of Ross River and focusing on Faro. But more broadly, I'm a social scientist looking at environmental justice questions of resource extraction and relationships with land. So yeah, we'll hop into it. Okay, so Krystal and I have worked together for a while, and in a lot of our discussions, especially with the Yukon Mineral Development Strategy and now with the mining legislation changes on the table, we kept having a lot of kind of frustration around conflicting reclamation narratives in Yukon, and this is connected to conflicting mining narratives more broadly. But we keep encountering phrases or discussions where people say, well, it's better now than it used to be. The reason these abandoned sites exist is because regulation and oversight wasn't what it is today. And therefore another Faro or, you know, pick whichever one you want, would never happen in today's day and age. At the same time, we see sites like Wolverine that continue to be abandoned and sites like Faro, Quetzal, and Mount Nansen that are decades into reclamation planning. And they seem to have these issues with getting these programs going. And there's also calls for updated mineral legislation, as Randy outlined, and a lot of failures to fulfill land use planning in a timely way, court cases from First Nations, and a lot of disputes around the mining kind of regime more broadly. And so this led us to question, specifically for reclamation, what exactly has changed in reclamation over the years of mining in the Yukon? What is the history of reclamation and regulation and policy in the Yukon? Why have successive changes in regulation failed to result in so-called success for reclamation, as seen in these failures that I mentioned earlier? And does the proposed mineral legislation actually offer ways out of repeating these historic failures?
Okay, so those are some good questions, but before we go any further, I think it's good to touch base about like what reclamation is, because I'm sure many of you are familiar. There is all kinds of our terminology in this field. You have reclamation, you have remediation, rehabilitation, restoration. And so it might be a little bit confusing about what we're talking about. And so like, welcome to the club, because there isn't a like universal or standard definition for these terms. You know, there are different standards that have been put forward, different groups choose them, but if you go between jurisdictions or between different countries, it all means something different. So for this talk, when we talk about reclamation, we're talking about kind of the entire process of transitioning land from being a mine to an alternative state. And, you know, within this definition, that alternative state could be whatever you decided or chose. So setting that reclamation goal is site specific, and it's a really like human decision or a values-based decision. So it's very subjective. So, you know, reclamation could include transitioning land to a golf course or to a spruce forest or to a solar farm. Like all of those, if that's what was decided upon, though that could be considered successful reclamation. But it also means that then there's lots of questions about whose version counts, who gets to decide. So that also comes along with reclamation. You know, there is no right answer to what success looks like. It's also probably good to touch base here on what reclamation is not. It's important to understand that reclamation doesn't reverse mining. You know, when the land is mined, and this is a picture here of the Eagle Gold Mine in Mayo, north of Mayo. You know, you remove the vegetation, you remove the soils, you drill into the bedrock, you blast the bedrock apart, grind it up into little bits, and redistribute it across the landscape. You know, that's a fundamental change to that place, and that's not inherently bad. You know, like change doesn't mean bad, but it is a very big transformation. So it's important to understand that like reclamation cannot reverse that. It can create you know, different outcomes, you know, golf course or solar farm or forest. You know, there'll be some technical limitations. So, you know, it's an important activity, but, you know, we're not going backwards on this one. And if you want a little bit more kind of information or discussion about that, I put out a discussion paper a couple months ago, and I think Adele will bring that up in the chat.
Okay, so we're going to break down our kind of historical review of reclamation in Yukon into 3 parts here. The first part I call gold rush frontierism. I'm going to go through that really quickly. Reclamation, not a big thing in that era. And then we're going to go into the 1970s and 1980s, what we call a kind of Rachel Carson environmentalism, linking to these broader ideas of contamination and water quality. And then finally, the 1990s into present day and notions of sustainable development and how reclamation comes to like kind of how it's grounded in the Yukon through these different phases, how the language changes and how we see that on the ground. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the gold rush frontierism, I just want to start this slide with acknowledging that before Yukon became a territory as a settler colonial jurisdiction, it was the territories of 14 Yukon First Nations. And so I think it's important to recognize that when Yukon became a territory in 1898, that was done through things like the Dominion Lands Act, which is an inherently colonial Western legal structure that was used to essentially steal land from Indigenous communities for mining, agriculture, and settlement. And through the Dominions Land Act, the Yukon Territorial Act was created, and through that as well, the quartz mining regulations of 1898. And so Yukon was created around the Klondike Gold Rush, and through these very colonial aspects of colonial legal structures of land theft. And the quartz mining regulations in 1898 don't include anything about reclamation. One interesting thing that they do include is a provision for compensation to be made to private property landowners who experience damage or harm because of mining. And so that's, you know, a side story about what private property is and who can own property and how that damage is determined. But there was kind of these ideas of environmental harm or land harm being compensated for. But beyond that, we don't really see any evidence of discussion of reclamation, and it wasn't necessarily important in the Yukon mining context. As early as the 1900s, early 1900s, however, you do see Yukon First Nations. There's a lot of evidence that all of the nations have presented demanding various types of land governance, compensation for environmental harm, and this notion of taking care of space, which is what we see in contemporary ideas of reclamation. And so even though that's generally overlooked in the history of mining in the Yukon, told through a settler colonial lens, these resistances and narratives have been happening for a lot longer than we tend to give credit to. In 1913, you get the first kind of industrial scale mine, Kino, and 1924, the Yukon Quartz Mining Act comes into play, and it's mostly based on the quartz mining regulations from 1898. And then in the 40s and 50s, you have this same kind of legislation that's directing mining, but you have these post-war government influxes of cash for roads to resources programs and prospecting. And so this is where you see a really big boom in a different type of mining in the Yukon, which includes barrow. And I think a key point, sorry, just on that last one before I move on, is that legislation in this time period was directly facilitating claiming of land or theft of land, right? So the legislation really focused on how to make land accessible for a certain type of people for mining and for settlement. And environmental regulations were not a big part of it. Okay, so in the 60s and 70s, you see a much more widespread public concern about industrial contaminants across North America, which leads to the creation of various environmental regulations. Most importantly, for the Yukon mining industry, you get the Northern Inland Waters Act, which was enacted in 1972, and it regulated the deposit of waste into water. So the Northern Inland Waters Act also established the Yukon Territorial Water Board, and this gave the board legal authority to require financial security and establish reclamation or cleanup requirements to protect water quality. So it's actually in the 1970s where you first start seeing financial securities being required and reclamation or abandonment plans, as they were called at the time, although the word reclamation was also used. It's not a new term. In the 1980s, you get public hearings, which become a foundational part of water licensing, and reclamation and financial securities play a central role in these public hearings. So people from Yukon Conservation Society, for Faro, folks from Ross, and a lot of other First Nations play pivotal roles in these public hearings and often are talking about the need for reclamation and financial security. So there's countless examples of this in hearing transcripts in the 1980s. In the 1980s and also in the 90s, you also see the closure of several major mines across the north, including Faro. And this really forces regulators to start to confront the realities of abandonment of these large-scale industrial mines. And the evolution of the Northern Inland Waters Act, public hearings, increasing requirements for reclamation and closure planning in the 1990s. All of this is really well exemplified through changes to water licensing at Faro, since it was operating throughout this entire period of change in the Yukon. So I'm going to show some examples. If anyone doesn't know where Faro is, I'm assuming most Yukoners have heard about Faro, but that's where it is. We can go back to that if anyone wants to. Okay, so Faro opened in 1969. It was very, very quickly pushed through permitting. The government and the company, I think, could see 1971, 1972, this new legislation coming down the line. It had been discussion for a while. So Faro was very conveniently permitted in under a year. In 1974 through 80, you start seeing the first examples of closure and reclamation plans at Faro. The first financial security at Faro was required in their first license in 1974. However, companies continue to play Russian roulette with the regulators, so they only update reclamation plans or post their financial securities at the very last minute in order to fill license requirements, while also threatening closure and loss of jobs if these plans are not approved or if financial securities are not decreased. So this is an interesting point to make, given the context of some of the current mines that we're dealing with today in the Yukon. Individuals participating in the public hearings in the 80s, like the quote on this slide, expressed deep concern about long-term responsibility, and they pushed regulators to include tangible and measurable objectives for reclamation. So you see Roger McCandless, who's an Environment Canada employee in the 1980s, pushing that they don't want the public to assume the risk and that they don't want the environment to assume the risk, that they need to prove that the tailings aren't going to oxidize and that they have mechanisms in place. It was known since the 1970s that Faro had high potential for acidifying tailings. And this was actually put into their license as well, so that they shall abandon the sulfide-rich waste rock in a manner that reduces the likelihood of acidification. So despite the addition of reclamation objectives and research and water licensing, Faro was obviously abandoned in 1999 and is now one of Canada's largest contaminated sites. And over 20 years later, it is still in the process of reclamation planning. So a process that started in 1970s is continuing today. And as Pharaoh moved through various starts and stops in the 90s, new rhetoric about sustainability and impact benefit assessment started to come into play as well as it was closing. And such narratives were readily taken up in reclamation planning for the upcoming mines after Pharaoh, which Krystal is going to talk about.
Thanks, Caitlin. So yeah, that brings us to kind of the era of sustainable development, which has been sort of the last 30 years. And the Brundtland Commission's report to the United Nations, Our Common Future, really put that term and concept into global policy kind of discourse. Sustainability is not a new concept in many cultures. And what I find interesting is we see it come to the Yukon very shortly afterwards. You find it in the Umbrella Final Agreement with the definition there. It is an explicit objective of Chapter 11, land use planning, as well as Chapter 12, which is development assessment. So this idea of being able to develop sustainably really sort of becomes a key focus of regulation in the territory. And we see it enter the Quartz Mining Act in 1998, when it gets a new part 2, that explicitly looks at land use and reclamation. And I will talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. We have devolution, where the responsibility to regulate mining and mine reclamation is devolved from the federal government to the territorial government. The legislation at this time doesn't change, it just gets mirrored. So it's now the Quartz Mining Act instead of the Yukon Quartz Mining Act. We get our first mine site reclamation and closure policy in 2006, and we get some further guidance in 2013. So this is a really big shift in thinking. We're not just in that idea of contaminants and contamination, but how can we develop sustainably? How can this be done? And this is really the concept of which reclamation is approached during this time. So looking specifically at part 2, like Randy mentioned, there's a pretty common understanding that we have really old mining legislation in the Yukon. And this was really shocking to me when I learned that we had amended it in 1998 to explicitly address environmental protection and reclamation. And you can see that in the purpose of this part. Now mines are required to have a quartz mining license, and it's within that license that requirements to reclaim like terrestrially on the land and what that needs to achieve can now be set within this legislation. So this came in 1998. What we can note as an absence is that there's no mention of upholding Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal treaty rights. And this gets amended in 2013. So this actually is part of our current legislation now as the purpose of part 2. But the legislation that we have today regarding reclamation, it wasn't baked into it. It wasn't developed with that in mind. So why does this matter? Well, as we think about making new legislation, I want to start out with I am really supportive and excited about this process. And I'm really grateful for all of the work and the hours and the thought that has gone into this. It's been a pretty big process already, and I think it's got a long way to go. And also, if we look at the discussion paper that YG put out, it talks about the aim of this new legislation. Like, I can align with that. I think this is exciting and important. I also want to point out that it is very similar to the purpose of the legislation that we currently have. So this is the purpose of part 2 from the Quartz Mining Act. And if you look and compare those two, they have the same elements there. And what is exciting about this is this gives us an opportunity to think about what has and hasn't worked in the past. If we had this same intention the last time that we amended legislation, we can now go look back and be like, okay, is this legislation meeting our intentions? Where is it doing a good job? Where is it not? So this is from the this is the one pager, the reclamation one pager that YG put out. So we're going to take a look at that. One of the things that I think is really exciting is that they've identified the challenge for reclamation as, we need really clear requirements. And I couldn't agree more with this. I'm a little bit biased. This is what my research looks at. What does success mean? But I do think this is the key challenge with reclamation. Reclamation is hard, and setting objectives and getting different input and understanding what success means, because it means different things to different people, this is really hard to do. And this is not a Yukon specific problem. This is all over the world. And this is also not a new problem. So we have known that reclamation requirements and clear ones are really important for decades. So what we have this opportunity now with the new legislation and looking back to what we've learned from in the last 25 years with our current legislation is we can go back and see where we've been doing well, where we haven't. So if I go back and I look at a reclamation plan today, I can go in and be like, okay, are they setting clear reclamation requirements? And you'll go in and there'll be this little spiel about we need to do objectives-based planning. That's in reclamation plans these days. And then there'll be an overarching goal. And then they'll say, okay, so we have these clearly defined objectives and tangible criteria, and they're presented in this table. And if we look at the table, then we can see, okay, this is slightly amended because I had to take out a column between objectives and criteria. They also list the activities that they're going to do. It didn't fit on the slide. What is important to note is we have these objectives and then we'll have this criteria. This is what is going to be used to measure whether or not we are achieving what we said we were going to achieve. You know, and you can see in this, like, we're not setting those. That's not happening right now. So now we have an opportunity to go back and look through the regulatory documents and see, okay, is this something that's being overlooked? Is this something that's being avoided? Could we think about how legislation could address this? It's not able to address everything, but maybe there's some opportunity there. If we go then to the potential approaches that YG has put forward in the reclamation one-pager, we can see there's a bunch of different things. And we'll go through each of these bullets separately. We're not going to talk about managing abandoned sites today in 25 minutes. It's just not going to happen. So starting first with reclamation requirements. You're up, Caitlynn.
That's me. Just distracted by text messages about that red line. Who put that there? Anyway.
It's a mystery. I was distracted by text messages about it. Just ignore it, everyone.
Nope.
Oh, it's gone. Good. Okay. Now I can get back to focusing. Okay. So the first section that YG proposes is reclamation requirements. So in putting in place more reclamation requirements, specifically they focus on progressive reclamation, which is cleaning up as you work, could be encouraged or required. And they're also looking at ways to discourage proponents from not completing reclamation. So in the kind of, I guess what we're doing today is looking back at the idea of progressive reclamation, and that it has actually been talked about in the past, and that we've already looked for ways to encourage or require it, and that there also has been ways to discourage proponents from not completing reclamation. And so I'll pull up some Faro examples again. Krystal said this made her depressed, so hopefully it doesn't make everyone else depressed. But in 1970s, actually, employees at Faro for Cypress Anvil were talking about progressive reclamation and the need for it. They said that awareness of the need for reclamation of mine sites is not new. They were planning for that to be included in their water license, and it was included, not with the term progressive reclamation, but with requirements to do things progressively, including reclamation research, test plots for tailings covers, revegetation programs in the 1970s and 80s. And so there is no benefit, this person says, to be gained in postponing a start on this work, since very few areas can be expected to vegetate and stabilize naturally within a reasonable time span. And so these were things that were included in their water license. As Krystal noted, this shifts in the 90s when they also have to have a quartz license. And in 1997, you see the first uses of this term at Faro. So their license made specific provisions for expenditures for progressive reclamation that would come out of their Reclamation Security Trust, which was the system set up for their financial security in the 1990s. And so this is all to say that these ideas of progressive reclamation, stemming mostly out of sustainable development, have existed for a while. It's not necessarily fleshed out in our current legislation, but in practice, these things have been discussed for a long time. And the actual reality of progressive reclamation is that it is almost always delayed. A company will always say, well, maybe I'm going to want to mine those tailings in the future, or I can't do the reclamation now because it will cost too much, or because, you know, we don't have the equipment or the time. And so there's this continuing game of kind of Russian roulette between companies and regulators, and then regulators obviously having political motivations to keep these sites open, and progressive reclamation always being delayed. And so I think within new legislation, there needs to be more attention to ensuring actual consequences for not progressively reclaiming.
Okay, so thinking now into improving reclamation planning. One thing that comes up is that there's never a lack of a plan, right? Reclamation plans or abandonment plans or decommissioning plans have been around. Faro had plans, Mount Nansen had plans, Wolverine had plans. You know, it's not a lack that these plans don't exist. And while they may increase in complexity, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're seeing these different outcomes. You know, and saying that we've never considered Indigenous land uses before, you know, Minto's reclamation plan of 1997 is explicit about hunting and trapping. You know, there have been workshops with different First Nations to set reclamation objectives since the mid-2000s. You know, and we're seeing now like Little Sam and Carmack's First Nation really having to advocate that, like, for the Mount Nansen project, that their expectations of the closure objectives that they signed in 2010 are not being met. So that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, just because there's participation doesn't mean that has meaningful outcomes. So we've been doing this for a while. You know, if you look at Wolverine, they had an approved reclamation and closure plan throughout their temporary closure right until they went, you know, and that got updated over time right until they became an abandoned site. So it's not necessarily that there's this lack of planning. You know, and if we think about going back to that table that I brought up earlier, you know, if we don't have this criteria, you know, why is this getting overlooked? Why is this getting avoided? How is that happening? Because if you can imagine, if you're trying to like say, hey, you need to do some reclamation, if you don't have criteria, how do you bring that forward? You know, is this because, you know, we're trying to avoid enforcement? I don't know, right? But we have an opportunity to look at that. You know, why aren't these specific requirements being set? What is happening with planning? How could legislation address it? And again, it can't address everything. And thinking also to, okay, monitoring and reporting, like this has been an expectation for a long time. You know, we have annual reports from current mines. And these are also really critical for being able to assess outcomes, right? Reclamation, you know, will have outcomes that we're trying to meet, and we need to track that over time. So if we look at the example from the little one pager, it brings up Brewery Creek. And my intention here is not to discredit the amount of work that has been done there. It's gone through one of our most extensive reclamation activities. Interestingly, it was permitted before 1998. So that also gives me questions. But if you look at this site, it's interesting. I found that they said that it was reclaimed because there hasn't been a terrestrial assessment or monitoring done on any of the vegetation or anything on that site since 2009 that I can find. And when I talked to I emailed YG about it, they said, no, we haven't done it. There hasn't been an application for a closure certificate, so they haven't looked at it. So if we're saying that reclamation has happened, but we're not assessing whether it's meeting outcomes, you know, we need that monitoring in order to assess that. And if we do have closure certificates or the ability to issue it within our current legislation, but we have no policy or kind of practice doing that. You know, we've never issued a certificate of closure in this jurisdiction, and every mine closes in one way or another. So, you know, again, saying that this is important is great, and we can agree with this, but if these mechanisms aren't currently working, we need to really think about why they're not working and address that specifically. So what have Caitlynn and I been learning by looking at this, the history of reclamation's past? Well, one, that we're really not seeing that planning, you know, automatically means action. We can have plans in place. If they don't get implemented, then, you know, we don't get anywhere. So how could we address that? What could we do to work on this? We see that regulatory complexity doesn't automatically mean better reclamation results. You know, just because it's a longer reclamation plan doesn't mean it has clear requirements in it that companies and regulators can be held accountable to. We also see that like Indigenous consultation or participation in processes does not automatically mean that their rights and values are upheld and respected. So what other mechanisms could be used to do that? Because that's very important. You know, so to think about like our intention of the new mineral legislation isn't that different from the intention of the previous legislation or our current legislation. So if we're going to try these approaches that we've already tried, we're unlikely to get different results. But it also have an opportunity to really identify the specifics of what we'd like to achieve, what's working, what isn't working, and then generate those solutions based on that.
Okay, so just to end it off, we wanted to post the 2 questions there that YG frames for their survey on reclamation. There's also sections on financial security and closure and abandon, or closure, sorry, that are separate. These are just for the reclamation. Obviously, those things are connected. And so we thought we could go back to those questions in discussion afterward, but just to conclude, we wanted to frame this idea of reclamation governance and also emphasize that the true fundamental change in this proposed legislation or proposed options for legislation is about enshrining Indigenous rights and governance and co-governance in mining. And so that is so important and to keep in mind and to bring through our discussions of reclamation more specifically when we're being a bit critical of what we see for actual reclamation. But just wanted to make note that we are excited about the potential for actually reframing what mining law could look like outside of colonial free entry system. And so wanted to conclude with understanding reclamation governance more broadly and care for land. And so I wanted to emphasize that the difference between what companies and states promise for reclamation and care of land into the future and the difference between those outcomes that they're promising and what is actually delivered is a matter of social and environmental justice. And so when these outcomes are not delivered on, the promises that are made by both regulators and companies are broken, and that agreement between community and their elected officials and the companies that they're working with is broken. And those communities will have to live with those impacted sites for many generations to come. And we'll have to deal with the wellness issues associated with that and the impacts of not being able to make relationship with land. And so that's much broader than the technical failure or the engineering failures of not being able to plant a tree or make a really good dam that lasts forever. And so assumptions and proclamations about better reclamation policy and technology and corresponding increases in financial securities are often used to legitimate mining development without addressing issues of Indigenous rights and sovereignty, access to land, the realities of long-term and cumulative impacts, community consent, or the actual necessity of mining in the first place, gold mining. So from the moment of staking, decisions are made on the premise that mining is the most beneficial use of land, going back to that Dominion Land Act and all of that stuff I talked about earlier. Reclamation policy is often used to absolve the sins of extraction and to fulfill sustainability narratives. And then also now to legitimate critical mineral development, rather than focusing on limiting our actual need to reclaim. And so in the context of this kind of strategic ignorance or forgetting of the past, I think we really need to reflect on and cultivate an awareness of local reclamation history and how that's situated specifically in the Yukon, what it looks like here. We need to reckon with post-industrial and reclamation realities. As what Krystal was talking about, we can't use reclamation as a mitigation tool or rely on notions of reversal. These sites will be forever different. And we need to be realistic about the inevitable or even long-term or even perpetual responsibilities of land care that these sites will imply. And so then we also need to question the privilege of mining land use, as I mentioned, the free entry staking system and the decisions in land relationships made through that privileged system. And we need to confront the capitalist interests that drive both extractive development That's one discussion, but also reclamation work. And so reclamation work is a very financially strong area. Billions of dollars get poured into reclamation. There's no impact benefit agreements implied there. There's no royalty structure there. How money is managed through those kinds of projects is a lot different than what it looks like for a mine in production. And I think that's an important thing to question through legislation as well. And the financial responsibilities that these companies have, they can still go bankrupt. Changes to mining legislation will not change the fact that companies can still go bankrupt. That's a broader change with bankruptcy legislation and corporate legislation. And so no matter what we do in terms of legislating or requiring reclamation, companies can still walk away. So all of this is to say that, Krystal and I think we need to establish mechanisms that hold companies and regulators accountable to the waste that they create, and also privileges Indigenous consent and local values in decision making about what constitutes adequate reclamation, but more broadly, what constitutes care and relationship with the lands that we live on. That's it.
That was a lot.
My conclusion was like longer than I had practiced. Anyway, sorry, I added some things. And thanks to all the people that gave us money.
We will leave it there. Do you want me to leave this up with the questions from the legislation, or do you like me to shut down my screen?
I will say maybe we can pop them in the chat, only just for the discussion. It's a bit easier if I can see folks.
Okay.
You took me on a roller coaster of emotions. I think I landed with hope, but I was definitely depressed for a little bit. But I think I really appreciate that sort of that historical framing, because I think so often we see something go wrong and it's, oh, it's a bad apple or like one off or a bad year. But if we keep seeing these patterns, I think it highlights that maybe we need to think about some systemic changes, like you pointed out. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions, which you can either, folks can feel free to throw them in the chat, or we could just do it the old fashioned way and you could, you know, raise your hand and ask a question. Oh, I see. Okay. CPAW's Yukon boardroom. I think I see a hand. So go for it.
I mean, I don't think hi, I really want to hear, I'd love to hear more, Krystal. At the beginning, you said, you know, you gave us the photo and you basically said you can't, once the mine is in there, you can reclaim it and make it into something, but you can't go back to what it was. And I really would love to hear more about that, because I feel like that's something that I hear a lot that is possible, and or that, you know, it can be better, or that can, you know, you could mine it and then put it back, and then, you know, it'll all be yeah. I really want to hear if more thoughts on that. I know you said there's a discussion paper, but if you have any other tidbits you want to share.
How long do you have? Thank you for the question. It's something I think about a lot. And I think that understanding of reclamation is actively created. Like, I think, you know, saying that we're going to go as close as possible to what it was before provides a way that we can all agree on that, you know, because it's a hard decision what those reclamation objectives are. So, you know, if you walk into a room and you're like, oh, you know, what's the reclamation plan? And I go, oh, we're going to go as close as possible to what it was before. We can all nod and think that's great. And we've actually agreed to nothing, because each of us is going to have a different understanding of what that could be. And in the discussion paper, I talk about, I think, you know, if we want to see reclamation outcomes improve, I think thinking of it as like a planning for change. You know, the landscape is going to change. What is that change going to be? And is that change acceptable? Because if you walk into a room and say like, oh, how is the land going to be different? Now I have to articulate what that difference is going to be. And then we can have those really hard discussions about, is that acceptable or not, right? Because that's going to mean different things to different people. And And when we saw the mineral development strategy, it definitely came out with like, oh, as close as possible to what it was before. And I think thinking of it in that way really masks the transformation that mining causes. And that's not better or worse, but just that it will be fundamentally changed, right? Like where the water is going to be is different, where the animals are going to be is different, where the plants can or cannot be is going to be different. So if we plan for change and determine whether or not that's acceptable, I think that it will help us develop those reclamation requirements at the beginning before we go past the point where we can't go back, right? Because once you mine, like that landscape is changed. And I think I'll leave it there.
I would just add that the language that mining companies use as well, and regulators use, like, good intentions aside, I'm not saying like good or bad, but it's strategic, right? For example, when Krystal and I were looking at, or mostly Krystal, and then I reviewed it, Krystal did the grunt work, was that companies in their update plans and their reclamation plans that aren't going out for public review, so just like their annual updates, have a pretty realistic vision or understanding of reclamation, and that it's hard and they don't have a detailed plan and all of these kinds of things. But when you see mines that go back into regulatory assessment through YESAB because they're expanding, their language shifts. It's strategic. It's a way to, as Sarah, or as Krystal said, it's a way to get public support and to avoid these kinds of hard discussions, right? And so that language, I think, is strategic, and it's not an inherent understanding that we all share of reclamation as being as some kind of reversal. And it's also not a term that is used the same in other jurisdictions, and the idea of reversal doesn't always exist in other jurisdictions too. So I think it would be interesting to see how companies and regulators here are specifically using that and how it shows up in plans and regulation and policy here.
Thanks for that question, Jyoti. I think that's a really important discussion, and I'm glad you brought it up. Maybe moving on to a more important question, Lewis Rifkin is asking, is that pizza for neighbors? I think pointing to the pizza party at Supas. Yeah, Lewis, I think you can feel free to head over so we can check that one off. And then a question in the chat from Heather. How does the local First Nation community of Dawson feel about the reclamation work done at Brewery Creek? Was it completed as per plan? And I'll say I certainly can't speak to that. I don't know if we have any folks from Toronto-Gwich'in who are in the audience who can, take a crack at it, but I just feel like I can't add any insight to that. But I think maybe it points to Caitlynn and Krystal, those broader issues you were talking about of both consultation, but then acting on that consultation and continuing to work with communities along the way.
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that question. That's definitely high on my list. And when I reached out being like, how are we going to evaluate this? I haven't looked at their reclamation plan in a long time. From what I remember, there is a specific section in there that it has to meet community expectations. So in theory, that has to be assessed at some point, I think.
Do we have any other folks with questions? I think I'd seen an earlier one from Helena about if there's a one-pager available. We don't have a one-pager. I'd love to chat with you more. I think there's lots of resources out there, but often they're wordier, and even our website, I tried to be concise and it ends up being quite long. Oh yeah, Helena, yeah, pop right in.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to iterate a little bit about that question. So I understand that it's the responsibility of the YG to do community consultation in the communities, but they only came to Mayo one time and they were here for 1 hour, and I happened to be sick during that time. But I don't think that YG is doing as much as they should to get the proper community consultation for the mining legislation. So how do we enforce them to do more in-person consultation with the communities? And how are we ensuring that they're documenting and getting all the information that's needed for the new legislation? do they do this through within the First Nation governments? Or are they doing them on their own? Do any of you know? And then I got another question after that, 2 more maybe.
Love it. I'll quickly wade in. No, I agree that the consultation or the engagement and consultation is, like I said, it's quite technical to wade into, and then maybe not as many opportunities as there should be. I think I get the impression it's all been really well intended, but sometimes people who are so close to it forget that it's hard for people to wade into, but it's so important. I think this legislation is going to be a few years in the making, and I think there's still time for Yukon government to change its approach and maybe go out to the communities more. But I will certainly advocate for that, and I think, you know, if others do, that is really helpful.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say I liked your point there, Caitlin and Krystal, about the accountability from regulatory and proponents. In my experience, we have one of the largest cyanide mines on our traditional territory, and they did a cyanide spill, which resulted in a federal, I mean, not a territorial government fine of $150. So this company is a multi-million-dollar company. I just don't understand how their accountability is $150 for what damage they're doing to soils, groundwater, animals, plants. I understand that they clean it up and put it back in the heap bleach, but what do we know? There's no research or no reference material to ensure that these soils don't change their characteristics in the future. So that leads into my other question. How do we do reclamation if cyanide goes into our soils and penetrates deep into near groundwater? What is I know that cyanide needs to be broken down by sunlight or a stabilizer or neutralizer, but how do we ensure that this cyanide that's penetrated deep in the soil isn't causing further harm to plants, groundwater, animals, fish, and those types of things? Is there any research or anything that helps in the result of cleaning up contaminated cyanide water that doesn't have any sunlight to it?
I certainly can't answer your question. I do know, I thought I had seen on here that we had Don Roberts from Yukoners Concerned, because I know they hosted a talk, I think it was last winter, where they had a water scientist, I can't remember his name, G. Wendling, maybe I'm making that up. Someone rescue me if you know. Sandy, do you want to pop in?
Yeah, it was Joe Wendling.
Okay.
He was looking at some increases in mineral concentrations associated with Brewery Creek. And it's been a long time increasing trend. I think in that case it was selenium.
But
But it wasn't.
yeah.
What I don't know what I can't recall what he said about the cyanide.
I do remember him talking about, like you had pointed out, Helena, that if there's sunlight that touches it, that it can break down, but groundwater is a different story. What I will do, I'll see if there's a link to that presentation, and then we can include a recording or a link to that in our follow-up notes. But I'm a bit stumped about it. But I think it just shows the complexity of the things that we're grappling with in the unknowns.
Maybe just a short comment, Don Roberts. By the way, thank you for that great presentation by the two ladies. You did a great job, because that's one of Jill Wendling's real concerns, is this whole reclamation regime that is non-existent in many ways. It's a lot of words, but no action. And I think if anything in the new Legislation Act, we've really got to reinforce that fact that the reclamation has to be looked at, not necessarily for our lifetime, but for our children and our children's children, because that's what they found out in Brewery Creek. Cyanide, of course, after 10 years, they went up and did a test, and this is YTG doing it, and found that, well, there was really no changes at all. And then they went back in 20 years at Brewery Creek and found, wow, there are changes. There are changes in the water, there are changes in the land. And basically, that's the concern. what may have appeared to be no problem to start with now becomes a big problem. And that was just a small mine. Now we're looking at huge waste facilities, both in the Mayo area, Victoria Gold, and then the Newmont, and then along comes Casino, and they all want to use that same procedure. And some of these, areas are going to be huge along a huge, one of the biggest rivers in the country, biggest rivers in the world, the Yukon River. And eventually, who knows what happens in 20, 30 years, but we do know what happens at Brewery Creek. And there's no real fix on that yet. So I think we should be concerned as Yukoners, not necessarily, I mean, we should be concerned today, but we should be concerned about it tomorrow. I may never see it happen in my lifetime, but we're starting to see what's happening in small examples like that. So Gilles has been, and I think one of his biggest issues is what you mentioned, the regulations, the rules, the monitoring. That's not being done. If it's being done, it's not being reinforced. $150 fine for something that's major. What does that tell the mining people? Oh, not to worry, just go to Yukon and you can get a free pass. And I think that's what even First Nations, that's even what the companies themselves have told us when we've met with them, that we need to have the rules and regulations very clear, and they have to be implemented and they have to be monitored. So I really appreciate for you underlining that again, because to me, and I really appreciate the fact that this government has decided to do a review, but let's see the action. We're going to have to see it in place. It's a lot of talk before the next election, but I would really like to see us have some legislation in place before the next election, and they can go to the polls and ask the people if this is what they want for the future. So, thank you very much for all this. This is a great opening in trying to build consensus.
Awesome. Thank you, Dawn. I just, I see there's hands raised. I'm just going to note it's 8:07, so don't feel like you have to stick around, but also I'm not going to shut down the Zoom. We have conversation going here, so I don't want to cut anyone off. Helena, I see your hand. So maybe, and I see a couple of points in the chat. So I'm going to go to you, Helena, first, and then I'll go to the chat.
I just wanted to add to Dawn's point there. Yeah, it's concerning to me, considering that our one watershed, the McQuestion watershed, we're going to have 3 heap leaches in this watershed. This is 2 from Victoria Gold and then 1 from Banyan Gold. We're going to have 3 heap leaches in one watershed. So where's the research that ensures that we're not going to be contaminating what's around us? And how are we ensuring that future generations have places to hunt and fish? So I just wanted to bring it to your attention that these are the concerns of Indigenous people. And not only that, it's permafrost. We have to be thinking about permafrost, climate change, the melt, the restructures to lands. And it's just, there's so much risk associated with these projects, and it's scary. And I just wanted to add that. Masi,
Helena.
Thanks, Helena. I was just going to add one thing too, just to link back to our presentation, because I think I don't know the details of how cyanide is taken up in the environment or the remediation mechanisms for that, but that's something we can probably look up and provide. But just to emphasize that reclamation is not like, it's often not fixing a thing for a walkaway solution. And the majority of large scale mines require long-term, if not perpetual, water treatment, monitoring, and collection of contaminated waste and contaminated water. So Faro is obviously like that. And the majority of these sites with heap leaches are going to be like that. Anything with any kind of tailings has a dam that needs to be maintained and has water collection that needs to often be treated and monitored. So the idea of reclamation being something where we can like even transition it into some other type of thing and then like walk away or use it in a different way is also misleading. And in a lot of cases, this more so turns into long-term monitoring than it is like a total change in the use of the site to something that, you know, might facilitate hunting, right? At Faro, for example, you have dust deposition surrounding the entire area. They are not going to cover the entire area of Faro, and yet there's no wildlife studies done on how dust is uptake into the bodies of animals that are in that area, right? And groundwater issues related to Faro, those things become visible over decades and over centuries. Those are not things that we are going to be able to like comprehend and map out in a matter of a permit of a mine. So, yeah.
So I have a
Thanks,
question.
Caitlin. Yeah, go for it, Sandy.
You know, the government, and you can see that as the federal government, the territorial government, maybe even some First Nations governments are more or less have become the insurance policy for the mining industry when it comes to bad actors and reclamation that has gone awry. And I'm wondering if in your research, if you've seen any precedents in other industries where industry has actually been forced to or has been legislated to take on that responsibility. I'm thinking something along the lines of the orphan well program in Alberta. I don't know how successful that has been. It'd be interesting to see if the reclamation efforts that have been done associated with that industry have improved as a result of that type of approach. And should we not be looking at the similar type of approach here, where if a bad actor leaves the country, becomes bankrupt, then the industry still has the liability to clean up the mess?
Yeah, so I can take a quick jump on that one. The orphan well program in Alberta is like famously controversial. So I would suggest looking up the Narwhal article on it. They did a really great long form article on abandoned well program in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I can't really speak specifically to that program, but it was a really good research article there. As far as like other industries, I think that the nuclear waste industry in Canada has a lot more regulation around waste management, has a lot stricter rules and oversight. And obviously nuclear waste is very dangerous. But in some ways it doesn't last as long as some of the waste that we're talking about because it does have a half-life. Things like giant mine will be there forever, right? And even Faro in a different way. And so I think that looking towards how nuclear waste is managed is one example. And specifically in Saskatchewan, where uranium mining is also a huge issue or is a big industry there. There is an example of what's called an institutional, I can't remember the exact name, but it's like the Saskatchewan institutional program where mining companies have to put in money that is then used by the Saskatchewan government to reclaim sites. And so this is something that has been used in other jurisdictions. Whether or not it can be used in here in the same way is hard to say because of the population size of the territory and the numbers of mines here. But there are these kinds of systems, or if you think about like extended producer responsibility in the plastic industry, things like this where mining companies are required to put resources into this. Another example might be Western Australia, where they have an actual arm's length organization that manages reclamation separately from the government and separate from the government departments that also lobby and promote mining. So these are all kinds of examples. And yeah, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and Yukon would have other examples to look to.
Might also add to that, one of the things I think that's important to consider, and I think sometimes when we think about security, is that, you know, all of the money in the world can't do certain things. If we haven't, you know, if the topsoil wasn't salvaged well and stored, like even if we had millions of dollars, like replacing that topsoil, and that all of the little plant propagules and all the little seeds and the little bits of roots that might further sprout, you know, isn't necessarily like replaceable with more cash. So just to kind of caution the thinking that, oh, if there was all of the money, we could just do it. Some things, you know, if we do certain things, money can't replace it. that make sense?
Thanks for those answers. I'll just jump in really quick to Sandy, and I'd seen your email about that, but hadn't had a chance to get to it. I wonder, maybe that model could work for placer where and we're not even talking about that type of reclamation tonight, but where there's more operators at one time. I just wonder in the Yukon, when there's not a lot of hard rock mines operating at one time, if there would be even the capital available to cover one that went bankrupt. So we'll see. And that is a suggestion that we've thrown in of maybe a bonding pool for placer operators, so they could cover, if there are those bad apple who are in the industry. So
that's a system that's used in Alaska as well for placer miners.
Yeah. So Bob had left a question in the chat a while ago about what about more stringent environmental regulations for extraction of non-essential minerals like gold and diamonds? And I can jump in really quick because I know it's something when I was part of the input group for the legislation that there was some thought about, okay, if there's this bigger push for critical minerals, there's only so much land, there's only so much, there's only so much that the land can take. So maybe we should be discouraging, gold mining, but how could we actually do that besides banning it outright? And so there's been ideas like maybe higher royalties for gold mining so that it's less economically profitable and fewer people are looking to do it, and kind of shift things that way. I think my only comment is, I don't think critical minerals should get a pass, that there needs to be strict regulations no matter what you're mining. But yeah, curious to hear Krystal or Caitlynn if you have thoughts on that.
Want to go first, Krystal? Do you have any thoughts? Okay. Oh, I'm not going to give like very nuanced thoughts on this. Now in mind, just don't do it. Just don't do it. It's not useful in any way. I don't know, just ban it. But like, having said that, I agree with you, Randy. Yeah, I don't know. I just, I think it's interesting here in the Yukon that there's like this huge kind of like, we're latching onto this broader international narrative of critical minerals, and yet pretty much all of the mines here are gold mines. An interesting pivot that Kudzakaya has recently done to emphasizing different types of minerals that they're extracting. And so I think it needs to be cautious about some of these recycled like ways that mining companies articulate their value like over time, and this need for critical minerals. At the end of the day, it's like what minerals are actually available here and the technology that we need to extract them. And I think gold mining is a good question, and diamond mining, we should just get rid of it.
I know earlier we had a question from Heather. Oh, and I just want Heather to know that I haven't lost her question, but feel free to jump in, Krystal.
Yeah, I think I would land more around how we relate with land and how we treat land. Doesn't change a lot for me depending on what mineral it is that we're seeking. I mean, definitely asking the questions if this is essential, if this is needed. But I think, a lot of the green technology, like we need critical minerals to save, the world or whatever, doesn't talk a lot about reducing our consumption in general. So I don't know if I would land with regulations needing to be different or to be separate. I think how we treat land, we should be asking whether it's needed regardless of what mineral it is.
I think we could have a whole day-long discussion about critical minerals, but I really, I just want to see, Heather Sagers, I know you had your hand up earlier. Did you have a question or a point you still wanted to bring up? Might have waited too long on that one, but if you can always send an email too. So now I see it's 20 after 8, and maybe this is a good place to wrap up. Oh, I heard a peep. Did I? No. Okay, well, this was.
Can you hear
yeah,
me?
Sandy. Yeah. Oh, and I see Heather now. Go for it, Heather.
I just have this isn't, it's just related to the survey. Why hasn't the government like put some kind of a moratorium or stop to mining or, and placer mining now? Because this is going to take a few, couple of years at least, probably 3 years. When can could we request that? Would it be worth it? There's probably people going out there staking and planning now, and the government will just end up paying them off if things are changed.
Yeah, I can only speculate that I feel that Yukon government would find that a big ask, just knowing that during regional land use planning, there's been hesitation to put moratoriums on staking. Even the approval of projects, although, we've seen the First Nation of Nachunai done recently win a court case on that. Congratulations, although I know it is being appealed. So I can only speculate on the reasons for it, or, there's in the media, they've talked about it, but Caitlin, I see you're off mute. If you.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add that that there is a staking moratorium on all Casca territory, which is currently in place. So I think that that is an important thing to highlight, and the Casca have worked very hard on achieving that, and it has been in place for a long time. And also we'll note that a staking moratorium, I think there are really interesting discussions, especially within the context of land use planning. But that the majority of Yukon has already been staked, and those claims are maintained and sold. And so around areas like Faro or Kuzakaya, or there are companies in Yukon that currently hold those claims and will continue to hold them despite any kind of moratoriums. And so I think it's also important to kind of, if you ever look at claim maps, and to go see how that kind of free entry point actually ends up in claim of land for generations. Those things are not given up once they're staked. So
No, I was just referring to new claims. I mean, I know what happened in the Peel situation, with the land use planning. So, I mean, there has to be something that can slow things down to give the appropriate amount of time for new legislation to be put in place. Anyway, I don't think it's a bad ask. We could, if a few of us just made that point.
Yeah, no, I should be clear. I think there's a difference between an ask that government would consider big between one that's bad. And yeah, there's a lot of good asks that can be big.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask.
Yeah, and Bob is saying, make the cost of holding claims higher. Yeah, and that is a recommendation that a lot of people are putting into the engagement piece. Sandy, I see you taking yourself off mute, and then do you want to add anything?
That for me.
No, I put myself back on mute.
Oh. Okay. Sounds great.
I think Heather was back though.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Heather Cyrus here. I just wanted to make a comment. I know it's not to do with reclamation, but I guess I'm looking for ally here. In Mayo area, there's the Victoria Gold, and I know locally we don't see a lot of activity from them and a lot of consultation and a lot of visits from them. But in that paper, they really publicize, and they put a front on that they're doing great things for the Yukon, but they've got less than half of their employees are Yukoners. And, if you're going to do mining and it's going to, I know we've got our supporters and non-supporters, but if it's not going to benefit Yukoners as a whole, why do it? I just don't get it. And the amount of money that the government actually gets due to these royalties and stuff like that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think just keep that in mind while this is happening too, because I think that's really important. that if we're importing help and it's not actually supporting the local economy here and it's just doing damage, then why do it? Like, there has to be a good way, and there has to be a benefit to the damage. Like, it just like you have to drive your car, so you have to use gas. You have to get from A to B, but there has to be something for it. But I don't see it. But I think they've got half the Yukon bamboozled here because of advertisement and because they do it they spend a lot of money in the larger center, but not in the local area here. And the other thing I wanted to say was, I see a lot more damage from small little placer mines and changing the nature of the trees, because they can just plow it all down, and then all that comes back is poplar trees. And so you're changing the whole wildlife and who goes there after, and it takes years for some of that undergrowth stuff to come back, like the berry patches and things like that. So again, another thing, why let it happen if it's not benefiting local economy? Most of those placer miners aren't from the Yukon. That's just my comment. Thanks. Bye.
No, I really appreciate you saying that, Heather. I think it shows we can get sort of bogged down in technical discussions and feel intimidated by these engagement, but it comes so much back to the values that we hold and expressing those and questioning the benefits that are coming from certain activities, and is it worth it? And that probably means different things to different people, but collectively it makes a big difference to say your piece. And I see John McLeod, you have your hand up. And this might be maybe our last comment of the day. I might wrap it up at 8:30. I have a lady coming over to buy plants. Go for it, John.
Yeah, I'll keep my comments pretty brief. But the way to resolve all the problems that we've talked about tonight is to rewrite the Mining Act. And so if the Mining Act is rewritten properly and brought up to date, all of these problems with staking, with royalties, with damage, with non-payment of bonds can all be resolved. Because if you write it properly, nobody will be able to go on any of the land until all of these things are resolved right off the bat. So you won't get permission to mine unless you're financial. You won't get permission to mine unless you put up real money, not bonds that are taken out with insurance companies. And that would solve a lot of these problems. And that would also solve the problem of just getting in to claim any type of land. And so before that could happen, two things should happen. One, we should go to a complete moratorium and then let all the First Nations resolve their land planning and then start reclaiming all over again. And all the people who have claims now, you just wipe them all out, compensate them all and start again. That's the only way you're going to resolve it. And it's been done before. It's been done in many countries. West Australia was mentioned earlier. When they changed theirs, they had a moratorium till it was all resolved. So for me, it's quite simple. It just needs some political will. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think you ended on the great piece, the political will thing. And I truly think, I really encourage people to send in comments, because the Yukon government has committed to these big, bold changes, but it's always easy to start off with a big, bold commitment. And, Krystal and Caitlynn, you really spoke to that, of how, you kind of blew my mind when you compared the purpose of the Quartz Mining Act to the purpose of this new legislation, and that we have aimed to do these things before, but what's been the holdup? And I think political will is a huge part of it. And so the more voices saying, yes, we do want change, and we're going to hold you accountable to those words, the better. So I really want to thank Caitlynn and Krystal for their time and their generosity of sharing their research. And I want to thank everyone here. This has been a really great discussion. It's so nice to see people, even if it is over Zoom, and really appreciate what folks have contributed. So I hope everyone has a good night. Yes, please do.
Sorry, give you 2 more moments. When I get discouraged, I look for inspiration to what the nations are doing here in the territory. First Nation of Natchez and their company Yukon Seed and Restoration are using reclamation as a way to insert their rights and for cultural resurgence. We're seeing it in Casca territory with the Ross River Dena Council and Dena Cho doing really incredible work at Faro. I got to work with the Taku River Tlingit last summer on a plaza restoration site. That, you know, to end on a like, this is possible and change is possible and doing things differently is possible, that's where I get pumped up. That's where I get the energy.
Yeah, I'll add, sorry. And just to mention on John's thing too, like this has been done in other places where they have put moratoriums in. They have banned placer mining. Placer mining is not a thing that exists in the majority of like the mining world, right? And like look to New Zealand too, where like Maori iwi have direct say in who accesses their land for prospecting and where they access their land. So there are a lot of really cool communities and jurisdictions doing interesting things that go beyond the options that are presented to us by YG at this point.
Well, I can't sum it up better than that. So thank you so much, Caitlin and Krystal, and thank you to everyone. Enjoy the pizza in the CPAWS boardroom, and I hope everyone has a really good night.
Thanks for coming.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.